information you're going to see is going to be very controversial. It goes against the grain of what we have in bow hunting today as far as the marketing and advertising. And I want you to do one thing. Raise your hand and say, whoop, wait a minute, I've got a question. Or if you don't want to do that, look it up yourself on the internet, do the research. It's really an interesting area we're going to talk about today. So it's controversial, completely different, so please feel free to challenge me. That's the only way I can really learn. So we're going to talk about the power of penetration that even a caveman can understand. Have fun with this. So therefore I made a cartoon to start with, and the two cavemen are saying, oops, maybe we need to rethink this kinetic energy stuff. They've got poor penetration on a mastodon. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with this slide and take it through for the next 45 minutes to an hour. If you have any questions, feel free to say, hey, I've got a question. Let me know. And at the end of the presentation, we'll have about a half an hour for you to ask more detailed questions. So let's begin. Bow and arrow is a primitive weapon. We call it a primitive weapon because it shoots a projectile at subsonic speeds. And unless an arrow is traveling over the speed of sound, approximately 1,160 feet per second in sea level, it's a primitive weapon. It's not a rifle. So we're going to talk about primitive weapons. To better understand how these weapons evolved, our bow, we first need to look at the evolution of what physicists call the simple machine. The first tools and weapons that man invented. According to physicists, the four simple machines are the inclined plane, the lever, the wheel and axle, and the pulley. And in about 20 minutes, you'll see how all these simple machines are utilized in the bow you shoot today. It was designed thousands of years ago, and we see the Matthews bows, Bowtech, Hoyt, etc. Every modern compound bow, and even traditional bow, uses these simple machines. Early physicists and mechanical engineers invented the first simple machine, the inclined plane, about 300,000 years ago. And what they simply did is they sharpened the end of a stick. They made it an inclined plane. And by sharpening the end of a stick, they made a spear. It was easier to kill animals with a spear than club them with a stick. It's really, looking back at it, it's almost surprisingly simple. And their spear had a very long length to width ratio. We'll see some more pictures of that as we go on. But think about how these early weapons were designed in comparison to how our bow hunting equipment is used today. By putting a point on the end of a wooden shaft, Homo sapien and Neanderthal used the inclined plane to spear. However, Neanderthal never progressed any further in mechanical engineering than making tools beyond the hand spear. That's as far as the Neanderthal went. So I hope you're not offended by nudity, but some of the anthropologists that have studied Neanderthal said that the women hunted also. As you know, Neanderthal stopped evolving. Incidentally, they had something very much in common with today's rodeo cowboy, broken bones. It's obvious. The reason they had broken bones, they were having to stab animals with these hand spears. And they never evolved past that particular skill. Incidentally, this is all this information is by anthropologists. And myself, I am not a mechanical engineer, a physicist, or much less any kind of medical professional, but I've been trained and mentored by these people. So this information you're about to see is based on actual physics. Here's a 12,000-year-old simple machine, a bone spear point. As you can see, its length to width ratio is very, very high. It has a high, what's called mechanical advantage. Again, 12,000 years ago, they figured this worked better than a very wide, steep-angled projectile. Here's an illustration of a mammoth that they had found with a spear point embedded in the back right at the ribs. So by using this simple machine, early man actually killed the largest land animals. Here's a CAT scan of a spear point in a mammoth bone, I'm sorry. So early man, he encountered penetration problems the same as we do today in our hunting. The bone point embedded in the rib. As time evolved, rather than just the sharpened inclined plane, they developed stone points. This is a Clovis point, approximately 10,000 years old. What it is, though, if you look at it, it's a simple machine that's extremely refined. It has cutting edges. Its length to width ratio is very high. It took very little pressure for that point to cut in through, let's say, a mastodon or a buffalo or whatever. So keep in mind, these simple tools, thousands of years ago, used the mechanical advantage of length to width. The second simple machine was the lever. It came by thousands of years later where man could use leverage to throw a spear, achieving greater velocity and lethality, the atlatl. So now they could put a spear, eventually a lighter one, but by using a throwing board, they could achieve leverage to throw that spear with much more velocity and therefore greater lethality. So now man, Homo sapien, can throw a spear at a mastodon with a high, simple machine that cuts to achieve greater lethality, so without having to stab with the spear. About 64,000 years ago, man developed the bow. Again, another simple machine. It's simply a bent stick with some sinew for a string. It worked better than a spear. It was used on every inhabited continent, incidentally, except Australia, and also, incidentally, in the South Pacific. I don't think we have any Hawaiians here, but it's an interesting fact. Okay, interesting fact that in Hawaii, in the South Pacific Islands, they never used a bow and arrow. And when Kirby,
they had a small bow. The wood wasn't good enough.
What's that?
The wood wasn't strong enough to use. But they did have a small bow.
I see. What I read about Kamehameha in the battle, that last battle at Maui, they were fighting over control of the island. Kamehameha's army used cannons and muskets against his enemy. And then in 40 years after they met Captain Cook and the English on Hawaiian Islands, they adapted their firearm, and they went basically from the club and the spear to the modern muzzle-loading firearm in 40 years. Interesting fact. So what we see is the development of various points through the years, from stone, bone points to stone, and eventually in medieval times, iron points with various cutting blades that did various different types of functions. They think this one was used for cutting rope in medieval naval battles. Various long-pointed ones, bladed ones, arrows that would whistle. They did a number of different things with the arrow points. I'm going to talk very briefly about this situation right here in Agincourt, France in 1415, because it really shows how man adapted to a situation using the bow and arrow. King Henry V had an army in France, and the Battle of Agincourt on October 25th, 1415, pitted 25,000 French knights who were armored, and they were armed with swords and lances. And they had the state-of-the-art armor, plate armor, and chainmail. And they were up against only 5,900 English soldiers. But the English soldiers had two advantages. One is they had strategy. They attacked, even though they were outnumbered. They attacked the French, and they used the longbow and the arrow. And the results were kind of interesting that we're going to talk about. They didn't use the standard broad-headed arrow in that battle, typical double-bladed broadhead against the French armor. What they used is a specialized arrow. It's kind of interesting. It was a heavy wooden ash arrow, but it was pointed. Hit one here, the wrong one. There we go back here. Its arrow point was a 400 grain iron bodkin point. It didn't have blades on it. And the thing that's interesting about it is that these early physicists, they didn't know they were physicists, but they knew that if you shot an arrow that weighed as much as that and you had a needle point on it, all of the energy was directed to that point. Think about a needle that you get a vaccination with. It's not dull and it's not wide, it's very narrow and it's very sharp. So they could direct a tremendous amount of pressure on this point. So less effort was needed for that particular bodkin point to penetrate. They say, anthropologists and historians say that in the first few minutes of that battle at Agincourt, the English walked up to within bow distance of the French army, and they drew their bows and released arrows. And they say during the first, the first few seconds of that battle was conclusive that they launched somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 arrows per second. These English soldiers were trained as young people to shoot arrows so quickly and so accurately, they could actually shoot 7 arrows in the air before the first arrow hit the ground. So what these arrows were basically is depleted uranium out of miniguns. So the bodkin point penetrated not only plate armor, these are right off the internet, they also penetrated chainmail. And although chainmail and armor could stop a sword cut or a lance blow, they couldn't stop the arrow, the bodkin pointed arrow, because of all that pressure just on one little needle point. Moving on to more advanced tools, we'll call them tools. The firearm, the first firearm, the matchlock, followed by the flintlock, and we'll jump 1,000 years ahead, so to speak, to a modern military firearm, 50 caliber firearm. This is an interesting example of firepower. We're going to be talking about this because it has something very much in common with the Battle of Agincourt and the longbow. They both shoot high mass projectiles. And keep this in mind, high mass projectiles. Moving on to the beginning of modern bow hunting as we know today, Saxon Pope and Art Young are my heroes personally. Without Saxon Pope and Art Young, I don't know where bow hunting would be today. I hope some of you have read Saxon Pope's accounts of his experience being the medical doctor for Ishi, who was I guess we'd call him the last true Aboriginal American. They found him, or he found us, sometime in the early 1916 to 20, I forgot exact date, in California. He was the last Indian of the Yana Indian tribe. Primitive Indian. He didn't know anything about iron, didn't know anything about firearms. Saxon Pope was his physician, became fascinated with Ishi. And because Ishi was an archer, a bow hunter. And his friend Art Young and him began to study bow hunting, made bows and arrows based on Ishi's experience, and they started hunting in North America. They first started out with deer, birds, eventually hunted, believe it or not, in Yellowstone National Park through a special permit, and these two fellows shot grizzly bears. There was no equipment made at the time. They made their own bows, they made their own arrows, they made their own broadheads. And in the 1920s, Art Young and Saxon Pope went to Africa on a safari. If you had a chance to read about it, it's fascinating. They took thousands of arrows, dozens of bows, and they went to Africa, and the main animal target that they wanted to get was the lion. They didn't hunt plains game as a main target. They wanted to hunt lions. They took over, I think, 20-some lions, 6 of which were bow kills, no rifle backup whatsoever. And one of my favorite lines that Saxon Pope wrote is they would get on the trail. They were in a Ford Flivver. It was an early Ford pickup truck, so to speak. They had 2 backup gunners, a guide and another fellow named Stewart Edward White. And they would drive along the plains, and they would find lions. And they would pick one and just slowly follow him behind. I don't know if you read this. It's fascinating. Finally, the lion would say, enough of this, and would stop. They would get out of the truck, and they would try not to get any closer than 70 to 90 yards. They would step out of the truck. The 2 backup guns were on the side. They would stick their arrows in the ground, get their longbows ready, and I love this line, commence hostilities. And they actually had 6 lion kills that did not have to be backed up with a rifle. If you get a chance to read Pope's account of his hunting, please do so. It gives us some background on where we are today. And of course, Fred Bear, Ben Pearson, the more contemporary bow hunters. A school teacher in Kansas named Allen invented in 1966 the compound bow. He used the 3rd and 4th simple machines, the wheel and axle and the pulley. Wheel and axle, pulley could compound the energy in the limbs. And that's where we have our compound bow today. Developing broadheads over the years, steel broadheads that were both tied on and glued on and then screwed on, to today's modern screw-in broadheads that have replaceable blades, trocard tips, and mechanical expandable blades. And here we are today, the latest version of the bow hunter. Come a long way in 300,000 years. So let's talk about the next subject, kinetic energy. Everybody has heard the term kinetic energy. How much kinetic energy does your bow have, sir? You have any idea? Does anybody know what their kinetic energy is? How many? How many pounds?
60.
What's that?
60.
60 pounds of kinetic energy. It's enough to hunt most North American game. Anyone else? Anyone? Yes? Okay. Higher? Generally, the average compound bow is 70 pounds of draw weight, and with the arrows you have today, you have at least 65 pounds of kinetic energy. And if we look at kinetic energy, most of the information you have on kinetic energy, it equals lethality. If you have enough kinetic energy in your bow, you can hunt this animal, or you can hunt that animal. Here's a couple of quotes from the internet. Kinetic energy is the determining factor when it comes to penetration. The other factors play a part, but nowhere near to the extent of kinetic energy. If you've got enough kinetic energy, you can forget almost everything else. This is right off the internet. So a young bow hunter gathering information on hunting and hunting lethality, kinetic energy, wow, that's what I need. Much of the worry about penetration probably is left over from the days when most bow hunters were shooting primitive equipment, traditional equipment. Indeed, it was and still is more cause to think about penetration if you're shooting traditional equipment. But today's compounds are so incredibly powerful in comparison, there's plenty of kinetic energy to spare. That's the bottom line. Kinetic energy, what is it by definition? It's the energy possessed by a body because of its motion equal to 1/2 times the mass of the body times the square of its speed. In simple language, it's the mass times the speed, which is quadrupled. So the faster you can shoot a projectile, an arrow, the more kinetic energy you have. Therefore, according to most experts in archery today, the more lethal your bow is. So if you have identical arrows that have the same weight and are measured at the same speed, will have identical kinetic energy. True or false? Well, it's true. But if they are identical, will they be identically lethal? That's what we're going to talk about next. Think about this comparison. What I've got here are two identical arrows. They're carbon arrows. They're typically fletched with blazer vanes, and they've got 125 grain points on them that are in this protective sheath. So 125 grain point, if we shoot these arrows out of a modern compound bow at 250 feet per second, not particularly fast, they'll have 83 pounds of kinetic energy, a whopping amount of kinetic energy. This first arrow, I'm going to show you, has 125 grain cut on contact stainless steel razor sharp broadhead on it. Shoot it at 250 feet per second, it'll go right through an elk. 83 pounds of kinetic energy. But what you see on the internet is if you have identical arrows at identical weight and identical speed, they're going to be identically lethal. The second arrow is identical. It's the same length, same fletching, the same weight, the same velocity, and it has 125 grain point. Therefore, it's identically lethal, correct? What's wrong with this? It's got 125 grain rubber blunt on it. It will hit the target animal with the same amount of kinetic force, kinetic energy, as that other arrow with the broadhead on it. So when you think about kinetic energy, it's only theoretical as far as its lethality. The point, you get the point, so to speak. Rubber blunt, it'll hit the animal with the same amount of kinetic energy. If you take this particular concept a little further, Randy Johnson, Major League Baseball player, he can throw a baseball, weighs approximately 1,000 grains. He can throw that baseball 100 miles an hour. It's that catcher's mitt at 100 miles an hour. Has about 110 pounds of kinetic energy. So if you just look at kinetic energy, Randy Johnson is legal to hunt Cape buffalo in Zimbabwe. It really is pointless. And I want you to think about that. You say, oh yeah, it's got a lot of kinetic energy. It's only theoretical. It only measures how hard something hits, not how deeply it penetrates and how lethal it is. So here's an example of kinetic energy based on speed. Doesn't have very much mass to it, but it has a lot of velocity. Kind of similar to your modern hunting arrows that we have today. What you're about to see is this motorcycle rider traveling at about 35 to 40 miles an hour hit this pickup truck. Lots of speed, not very much mass, and he's hitting a target. Okay, here we go. The only reason I have this here is this particular motorcycle rider survives this accident and walks back. Isn't that unbelievable? He landed on his feet, so therefore I put this in. It should have been obviously a fatality, but it does show you velocity, but no mass. What happened? It stopped right there. Is that clear? It just had a lot of velocity, but no mass. It stopped. So kinetic energy measures how hard something hits, not how much it penetrates, but it's based on velocity or speed. Momentum, on the other hand, measures how much forward push it has based on its mass. Let's look at this next video. Okay, we have another car. It's going to be hit by a slow-moving train. Train isn't going very fast. It doesn't slow down because of its mass. Think about what we're talking about now in terms of your arrows. High velocity, low mass, gets there very fast, but it sheds its velocity very quickly. One of the laws of physics is that if you double the speed of a projectile, a bullet, an arrow, you quadruple the drag, the resistance. Think about this. You're driving in a car at 30 miles an hour, put your hand out the window, feel the resistance on your hand, pull it in, go up to 60 miles an hour, and put your hand out the window. Feel the resistance. We're doubling the speed, but we're also quadrupling resistance. Another example would be if you're in a canoe, paddling along at 1 mile an hour. Put your hand in the water. You can hold your hand in the water. Try it at 30 miles an hour. Try to put your hand in the water. It'll rip your fingernails off. You've increased the speed, but you also increased the resistance. So, if you go on the internet, many of the websites have recommendations for kinetic energy for bow hunters. If you're going, it's kind of like rifle calibers for hunting with a rifle. What do you need for buffalo? What do you need for elephant? What do you need for deer? Here's one that has an interesting picture. For a grizzly bear, you need 65 pounds of kinetic energy. If anybody's ever taken a grizzly bear and skinned them, you know that the bones are very massive and the muscles are massive, but the hide, it's thin. What we're doing here is we're fleshing out a brown bear hide, and you have to be very, very careful when you're cutting that meat off, because if you slip and make a mistake with your fleshing knife, you'll cut that skin. It's very, very thin, with the exception of the skin on the neck where the big boars fight. So kinetic energy, you can do hunt grizzly bears with less than 65 pounds of kinetic energy if you wanted to, if everything went right. Wild boar, 42 pounds of kinetic energy minimum. If anybody's ever shot a Eurasian boar, they are undoubtedly the toughest animals in North America. The reason they're tough is they develop a cartilage shield. This particular boar had a 2.5-inch thick cartilage shield over the chest area. You've probably seen videos on the internet of boars being shot with arrows going about 2 inches. Yeah, but they say, that's not all you need is 42 pounds of kinetic energy. Not even close. This is the toughest animal in North America, including grizzly bear and moose. How about this one, Cape buffalo? Well, that's a little bigger. We should up that to 65 pounds. This next shot is a disturbing shot. It was sent to me by a fella who went on a buffalo hunt, bison hunt in Wyoming. And this shot was taken just before the professional hunter shot the buffalo to put him out of his misery with a rifle. Arrow weight only 350 grains, had a velocity of 320 feet per second. The arrow was so light and was going so fast, it had 82 pounds of kinetic energy. There's a heart shot, never made it past the rib. They trailed this buffalo for several hours. He put another arrow into him. They finally had to put him down with a rifle. But look what the kinetic energy is. But it was only theoretical. This measures how hard it hit, not how hard it penetrates. So, kinetic energy based on speed in comparison to momentum based on mass. Remember, kinetic energy, projectile based on its speed, momentum on its mass. Here's an example of penetration using momentum. This is the scapula of a moose that's hit with an arrow that weighed about 650 grains. A lightweight carbon arrow with a lightweight head, 85 to 100 grains, would probably ricochet off it. But this heavy arrow completely penetrated the thickest part of this moose scapula. This is an interesting comparison I'm going to show you. We're going to talk about the ping pong ball versus the golf ball. They both are about the same diameter. The ping pong ball is about 2 millimeters smaller but it's filled with air. It only weighs 42 grains. The golf ball, 708 grains. What I've done on this particular test is modified a slingshot. And what we did is chronograph the velocity of these two projectiles. First of all, at launch velocity, a couple of feet away, and then we put the chronograph 10 feet away, and we measured the velocity of both these projectiles. Really interesting. The ping pong ball, although it weighed 42 grains, shot out of that slingshot, had a velocity of 170 feet per second. But at 10 feet, it lost 14% of its velocity at just 10 feet. So it started very fast, but it lost 14% of its velocity. Kinetic energy, 3 pounds. At 10 feet, it lost 1/3 of its kinetic energy, how hard it hits. So the golf ball, on the other hand, at 708 grains, it was much slower being launched out of that slingshot at 100 feet per second. But look at this. At 10 feet, it only lost 5% of its velocity. Didn't start very fast, but it didn't shed its velocity. Remember, double the speed, quadruple the drag. So the kinetic energy, it only lost 12% of its kinetic energy. Let me give you an example of this on a cardboard box. I have a ping pong ball, and I'm going to shoot it at this cardboard box, and it's going to hit that cardboard box somewhere at 170 feet per second. Knocked the cardboard box over, but it didn't penetrate it. So, kind of think about this example. Now we've got the golf ball. 708 grains. Slow, but has a lot of momentum. You think I could hit the box at this range? Let's try that again. This is embarrassing. Okay. Okay. So, take this one step further. There's a ping pong ball, 42 grains. Golf ball. You see where I'm going with this? Okay. Okay. I'm not going to do that. But you get the idea. What would you rather be hit with? A high-speed ping pong ball or a golf ball? Golf ball retains its momentum much, much better and its velocity than that ping pong ball. Now keep this in mind. It's a projectile, a simple projectile. There's not going to be a lot of difference between ping pong balls, bullets, and arrows. This is an interesting video you're about to see on Mythbusters, a TV show. What the myth was, can water protect you from a bullet? In other words, if somebody were shooting at you, if you could dive under the water, would you be protected? So what they started with is high-speed rifle shots. They had an AR-15 223, and they were shooting at a ballistic jelly target about the torso of a man.